Right now, you are surrounded by sound. Even in what you'd call a quiet room, there's almost certainly a hum from the refrigerator, a fan somewhere, the faint compression of a heating or cooling system cycling on and off. Outside, there are cars or birds or neighbors or the low ambient pressure of a city existing. You've probably stopped noticing most of it. Your brain filters it out automatically. Noise has become so constant that silence, real silence, is something most people alive today have never actually experienced. But for almost the entire span of human history, silence wasn't rare. It was the default. Until roughly 200 years ago, the loudest sounds most humans ever heard were acts of God. Thunder, a waterfall, the ocean during a storm, the crack of a tree falling. Beyond those, the world was, by modern standards, almost unimaginably quiet. The loudest man-made sounds, a blacksmith's hammer, a church bell, a cannon, happened occasionally in specific places and then stopped. They were interruptions in silence, not the other way around. At night, in most of the world, the quiet was total. No electric hum, no traffic, no distant bass from a neighbor's speakers. Just wind, insects, and the sounds your own body made. We know this because we have records of people noticing it. Travelers who arrived in pre-industrial cities often wrote about how quiet they were. Samuel Johnson, visiting London in the mid-1700s, described the night streets as hushed enough that you could hear a conversation from 30 meters away. That was London, the largest city in the Western world at the time. The first machine to permanently change that was the steam engine. When industrial factories began appearing in the early 1800s, workers inside them were exposed to something that had no precedent in human experience: continuous mechanical noise, sustained for 10 or 12 hours a day. The rhythmic hammering and hissing of boilers and looms wasn't just loud. It was unrelenting. There was no moment of silence between the sounds, no natural gap for the ears to rest. Factory workers in Manchester and Birmingham in the 1830s and 40s routinely went partially or completely deaf within a few years. Most of them had no idea why. Hearing loss, at the time, wasn't understood as something the environment could cause. It was considered a medical mystery, something that happened to some unlucky people. The idea that sound itself, at sufficient volume and duration, could physically destroy the inner ear had simply never needed to be discovered before because no one had ever built machines loud enough to do it. By the time the railroad arrived, the noise followed you. A steam locomotive passing a village didn't just disturb the silence. It obliterated it, briefly, violently, in a way that had been previously reserved for natural disasters. Contemporary accounts describe horses panicking, children crying, and villagers standing stunned on platforms, having never heard anything that loud in their lives. They weren't being dramatic. They genuinely hadn't. But here's the part that cuts deeper than decibels. Before the industrial era, human beings had an intimate relationship with acoustic information. In a quiet world, sound carried meaning in a way that's hard to reconstruct now. You could hear your neighbor's argument, your livestock getting agitated, a visitor arriving on the road a full minute before they appeared. The creak of a floorboard at night was a signal worth attending to. The silence after a bird stopped singing could mean something was wrong in the forest. Humans learned to read silence as carefully as sound. The absence of noise wasn't nothing. It was data. There's a reason so many spiritual and philosophical traditions across history, across cultures that had no contact with each other, place silence at the center of their practice. Buddhist meditation, desert monasticism, the Quaker meeting, where the expectation isn't that someone will speak, but that something worth saying might arise from the quiet. Indigenous vision quests that required days alone in the wilderness. These practices weren't decorative. They were responding to something real. The idea that silence was where the self became legible. That you couldn't hear your own thinking when the world was too loud. That wasn't mysticism. That was observation. What happened next happened gradually, and then all at once. The automobile made urban noise continuous. Electrical grids added a permanent 60 Hz hum to every building wired into them. Radio brought sound indoors on demand. Television kept it there. Earbuds made it portable. And then smartphones made silence a choice, one that an increasing number of people stopped making. Today, acoustic ecologists, scientists who study sound environments, use a measurement called the natural soundscape. They go to places that seem quiet and record them. In almost every location in North America and Europe, they can detect human-generated noise. On a clear day in a remote national park, they can hear a jet contrail. In what appears to be wilderness, they can detect the distant compression of a highway 20 miles away. True silence, the researchers say, is now one of the rarest things on Earth. The United States has identified a handful of 1 square inch of silence locations. Places where, if you stand in exactly the right spot, there's a reasonable chance you'll experience a full minute without any human-generated sound. One of the most famous is in the Hoh Rainforest in Washington state. People travel hundreds of miles to stand there and hear nothing. Which brings us back to the room you're sitting in. Your brain is filtering right now. It's deciding what sounds to pass along to your conscious attention and what to classify as background. That filter is a remarkable adaptation. Without it, the acoustic density of modern life would be genuinely unbearable. But that filter has a cost. Studies in cognitive psychology suggest that the mental effort required to manage constant background noise draws from the same reservoir as concentration, memory consolidation, and creative thought. Children in schools near airports or highways score lower on reading tests. Hospital patients in noisier rooms recover more slowly. The effect isn't dramatic, and it isn't from any single source. It's cumulative, a low, continuous drain. For the vast majority of human history, silence wasn't something you had to find. It was something you had to escape. Now, for the first time, it's the opposite, and the infrastructure we need to get back to what our ancestors took for granted doesn't exist anymore. Somewhere right now, there's a person paying a significant amount of money for a weekend at a monastery or a remote cabin or a float tank in the back of a wellness studio, just to experience something that a medieval peasant had every single night for free. We built the loudest civilization in the history of the planet. We're only now starting to ask what we drown out to do it.